Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Now, I've been on vacation for the last week up in northern Vermont where I grew up, giving me the perfect opportunity to test out my Canon R7 with my 18 to 150mm kit lens and my Canon R6 with the RF 24 to 240mm lens. Now, the Canon R6 comes in over $1,000 more than the Canon R7 body alone does, and the RF 24 to 240mm lens costs an additional $400 over the kit RF-S 18 to 150mm lens if bought separately. So one might conclude from price point alone that the R6 with the 24 to 240mm lens is going to outperform the R7 with the kit lens on it. Is that the case? Let's find out. Now, before I got these two zoom lenses, I primarily shot with the budget RF STM prime lenses. And in comparison with these two zoom lenses and those prime lenses, I still find that these zoom lenses are not as sharp as those prime lenses, as well as leaving something to be desired when it comes to image quality. That being said, I found it to be very versatile to be able to use just one lens throughout the entire day, so I do see the advantage to using zoom lenses, and that's something that I've been getting very used to. It's really nice to not have to carry multiple lenses with me and be able to just kind of compose a bunch of different shots with just one zoom lens. So while I sacrifice maybe some image quality and sharpness, if it's sharp enough to be overall good enough for what I'm looking for, then it's actually more of an advantageous scenario to just have that one zoom lens on there. So what we're going to be doing today is trying to weigh the pros and cons between shooting the Canon R7 with the RF-S 18 to 150mm lens and the R6 with the RF 24 to 240mm lens. One of the reasons I felt that this was an accurate comparison to make is when you use the RF-S 18 to 150 on an APS-C sensor camera and you use the RF 24 to 240 on a full frame camera, these two lenses cover a very similar effective field of view. So they basically cover the same range when used on the proper sensor camera body. The Canon R7 is smaller, lighter, and provides us with a higher resolution image, while the full-frame Canon R6 sensor is going to provide us with higher ISO performance and better dynamic range. Now keep in mind that the RF 24 to 240 is almost twice the price of the RF-S 18 to 150mm lens. Now, I intentionally did not denoise or sharpen any of these images in post. So what you're seeing here, there could be more done to clean up these images or make them sharper, but for the purposes of this video, I did not want to do any of that so that you guys could see what you could expect to see essentially straight out of camera. Now, when I first started editing these pictures, I thought that the RF-S 18 to 150 was providing a clearer and sharper image than the RF 24 to 240. But after working with some of these images and looking at a lot of the different scenarios, honestly, I didn't see any massive difference in sharpness or image quality that really would have made me choose one over the other. Now, the one thing that I do want to mention is the RF 24 to 240. When you're zoomed all the way out to the wide end of this lens, it's going to suffer from really massive distortion correction. And that's going to lead to not only chromatic aberration really severely in the corners of your frame, but also softness because they're stretching the corners of the frame out so bad. Now, it's not as bad as you go further into the focal length because it starts to cover the entire sensor there, but when zoomed out to 24 millimeters, you will see more softness in the corners, and I did not notice the same type of thing happening with the RF-S 18 to 150 millimeter lens. Now, the fact that I don't see any really big difference in image quality between the RF-S 18 to 150 and the RF 24 to 240 is really kind of saying something when you sit there and think about the fact that the RF 24 to 240 costs almost twice the money of the RF-S 18 to 150 millimeter lens. Not to mention, it's just way heavier. Now, while I didn't notice any real difference in image quality or sharpness in between these two different setups, the one thing that was very apparent to me when I was editing was the dynamic range of the R6 sensor. It's much easier to clip the highlights on your R7. Now, as long as you're paying attention and you make sure that you don't blow out your highlights, that's going to be okay. But it's definitely something that gives you a little more leeway when shooting with that Canon R6. It's much easier to pull back the detail in the sky. And like I said, with the R7, it's just a lot easier to clip those highlights. So the increased dynamic range is definitely an advantage to the Canon R6 sensor. And if I'm being completely honest, the dynamic range was probably the biggest difference that I noticed between shooting these two different types of setups. It was the ability to really retain the information in those highlights and be able to pull them back and get those nice blue skies into the shot, and not having to worry about clipping out some of the highlights, which did happen on some of my R7 images. So overall, I'm pretty happy with both of these setups, and the obvious advantage goes to the Canon R7 because as I was driving around, it was just so much easier to carry the R7 with the little kit lens, so much smaller, so much lighter than the big chunky clunky R6 with the RF 24 to 240. And if they're going to yield basically the same results, minus the fact that the R6 is giving me more dynamic range, which again, like I said, as long as you're paying attention and not blowing out your highlights, it's not going to be an issue for you. The dynamic range of the R7 is honestly quite good, while just not being quite up to par with the R6. Personally myself, I would probably choose to use the Canon R7 and the RF-S 18 to 150 millimeter lens over the Canon R6 and the RF 24 to 240 millimeter lens, just because of the reduction in weight and size alone. Also, giving me a higher resolution image is not a bad thing. With all things considered, these two setups come in at vastly different price points. The R6 with the 24 to 240 is going to set you back $3,400, while you're able to get the RF-S 18 to 150 with the Canon R7 for only $2,000. So the fact that there's such a big difference in price point, and the R7 with this lens is holding up so well against this setup, really speaks volumes to the Canon R7. Now, although I'm hesitant to call either of these lenses sharp, it's just the sacrifice that we make for a zoom lens in this price point. And the overall image quality is totally acceptable. It's not bad. It's just like I said, in comparison to maybe some of my prime lenses, they're not as sharp as those are. But at this price point, for a zoom lens, it's overall acceptable. Anyway, guys, I hope that this video helped you out a little bit. If it did, go below, subscribe, click that notification bell, and I'll see you on my next video.